as food. Then I'll talk about how we can use nutritional knowledge to help guide landscape restoration for leaf-eating animals. I'll finish by discussing some plans for future applied research in this space. I'm going to start with a simple question. What do you see when you look at a forest? What I see, superficially at least, is a lot of green. This may not seem like a very profound statement, but it's actually quite remarkable when you think about all the creatures that eat leaves. Why don't they eat themselves out of house and home? Why don't more landscapes look like this? This is a photo of overbrowsing from the Otways in Victoria, where koalas are eating themselves out of house and home. But most forests are green. This is an unusual situation. The reason that animals don't strip all of the leaves off trees as often as they eat all the veggies in your garden is because most wild plants are very good at defending themselves. Plants have a variety of physical and chemical defenses that help to protect them against herbivores. Quietly, right now, in every forest, there is a chemical arms race happening between plants and animals. This has been going on for as long as plants and animals have coexisted. Animals want to eat the plants want to survive, plants evolve ways to protect themselves, then animals get better at evading those defenses, plants adapt, and so on and so forth. Chemical defenses are often called plant secondary metabolites, and they can help defend plants either by tasting bad, such as being spicy or bitter, or by reducing the digestibility of nutrients so that a plant is less valuable to an herbivore, or by being toxic and directly poisoning animals. Animals must navigate chemically complex environments to meet their nutritional demands for survival and reproduction. Animals need to obtain a variety of different nutrients from their diet, but plant secondary metabolites can either deter them from eating a plant or stop them from digesting those plant nutrients. This means that the nutritional quality of a plant as food is influenced by both the nutrients, the good stuff, and the secondary metabolites, the bad stuff. When we talk about the good stuff for eucalypt leaf-eating animals, we often focus on protein. Protein is a really important nutrient for a whole variety of reasons, including playing an important role in growth and reproduction, but leaf-eating animals can struggle to get enough. Eucalypt leaves contain quite low protein concentrations. On top of that, some eucalypts contain high concentrations of tannins, a plant secondary metabolite that can reduce protein digestibility for some folivores. Nutritional quality can vary between eucalypt species and also between individual trees of the same species. We often tend to lump all trees of a species together and think of them as being the same, such as either being an important browse species for the koala or one that is not eaten, but that is not necessarily how the animals see things. To illustrate this figure is from a feeding study with captive koalas. It shows how much koalas ate on the left side of the graph when they are offered leaves from different individual manigums, a species that we think of as an important browse tree for koalas. Each point on this figure is a different manigum tree with a different concentration of FPCs, shown along the bottom line of the graph. FPCs are an herbivore deterrent plant secondary compound that some eucalypts make. You can see that koalas ate much less when the trees had high FPC concentrations compared to when the concentrations were low. This variation occurred across individual trees, even though the trees used in the study were all the same species. So variation in the chemical composition of trees creates variation in palatability for eucalypt folivores, with palatability referring to the amount of leaves that folivores eat from a particular tree. Variations in nutritional quality can impact how animals use a landscape and where they can live. Spatial variations in forage quality can impact animal reproductive success and population densities. One of the implications of living in a landscape with patchy food quality is that you can get variation in breeding success between individuals depending on where they live. So, for example, female brush-tailed possums living in higher quality home ranges have higher breeding success and their pouch young grow faster. We would expect something similar with the other folivores too. The variation in chemical composition that we see in the landscape is influenced by many different factors, some of which we don't fully understand yet. However, there's a strong genetic component, with secondary metabolite concentrations being highly heritable. There is also an environmental component, with factors like elevation influencing some nutrient and secondary metabolite concentrations. Also, if the type of leaves on a tree change, such as when epicormic leaves regrow after fire, nutritional quality can also shift. And changing the tree composition in the landscape through disturbance can also alter the nutritional quality of that landscape. Eucalypt woodlands and forests are not a buffet of equally palatable food for folivores. They're patchy landscapes, and to illustrate that, the circles in this image are manna gum trees in a 7-hectare woodland on Phillip Island. Each different color is a different level of palatability to koalas. So within their home range, the suite of trees available to koalas can range from highly palatable through to fairly unpalatable, even within a single species. The image on the right is at a much larger scale and shows how you get some areas within a contiguous eucalypt forest landscape where the available or digestible protein concentration is much higher than in other areas. Ultimately, the nutritional quality of landscapes can affect the density of animals that a landscape can support. This figure shows how the density of koalas at 75 sites across their range is related to differences in food quality. The graph shows that higher densities of koalas are present in areas with higher concentrations of available nitrogen and lower concentrations of species. So in summary, eucalypt leaves contain a variety of nutrients and plant secondary metabolites that influence food quality for eucalypt folivores. The specific combination of chemical constituents mean that some individual trees or even eucalypt species are more palatable than others. Leaf nutritional composition is influenced by both genetic and environmental effects. This means that landscapes are chemically complex mixtures of a range of palatable through to unpalatable trees, which can affect the distribution and abundance of folivore populations. So how can we use what we know from nutritional ecology to improve habitat restoration for folivores? Natural landscapes are usually heterogeneous. They have variation, even if you can't always see that with the naked eye. When planting, it's important that you include a locally appropriate diversity of tree species. Tree species composition is something you usually can see, but figuring out what should be where can actually be quite challenging. This is because many of the forests in Australia have changed in composition due to anthropogenic landscape change, like selective logging, clear felling, grazing, land clearing, prescribed burning, and increasingly severe and frequent wildfires from climate change. Often, a bit of research is necessary to work out what should be going where, and even then, it's an imperfect science, and we can only do our best to try to recreate the composition that should probably be at any particular place. The composition of forests can have profound influences on the nutritional quality of those landscapes. Besides species-level diversity, there are other forms of diversity that are also important, but cannot always be observed with the naked eye. Even in naturally occurring monocultures of tree species, you would expect to have chemical diversity that can influence the palatability of trees to animals in those landscapes. This diversity is important for both plants and animals to support the longer-term sustainability of the environment and the animal populations. That chemical diversity exists within and between plant species. Pryor's rule states that in a mixed species forest, species from the two main subgenera of eucalypt, which are commonly called monoclypts and symphymertals, tend to codominate. Notably, some eucalypt folivores seem to have evolved to tolerate the subgenre-specific secondary metabolites from one group of eucalypts more than the other. This specialization in the ability to contend with subgenre-specific compounds has been hypothesized to reduce competition among species that live together and support their coexistence. In landscapes where monoclypts and symphymertals naturally co-occur, revegetation should aim to maintain the codominance of the main subgenre to support folivore diversity as well. Following Pryor's rule in revegetation may also help folivores find suitable browse after fire, because preliminary research suggests that their diet choices might change when epicormic growth is available due to differences in epicormic chemistry. When I think about trying to improve the nutritional landscape, I'm always worried about potentially planting too much of a good thing and ending up with landscapes like this. You definitely can have too much of a good thing, and this can lead to overbrowsing and subsequent starvation of animals and the death of forest. Some forests in the Otways of Victoria are near monocultures of high nutritional quality browse. In this situation, there is clearly too much of a good thing, and it is not sustainable for the trees or koalas. Notice, though, that these trees are growing on very sandy soil. Despite what would appear to be low soil fertility, the leaves had some of the highest nutritional value of any that we have sampled, and I'll come back to that point in a minute. It's also important to understand that just because you are planting a species that is often considered a preferred browse, it might not be good food. That's because there is usually a lot of variability in herbivore-deterrent secondary metabolites even within the same species. This is critical for revegetation because you need to be aware of not just the species you are planting and that those species are appropriately diverse for that environment, but also that you have genetic and chemical diversity. Remember, the genetics of a plant can be a strong driver of palatability. FPCs, for instance, have a strong genetic component. To illustrate the important role that plant genetics can play in influencing nutritional quality, let me introduce you to this mosaic tree. The gene expression on one branch differs from the rest of the tree. The one branch contains high concentrations of herbivore-deterrent FPCs. The rest of the tree is highly palatable and overbrowsed. The whole tree is growing in the same environment, but varies hugely in its nutritional quality for folivores. This demonstrates how strongly genetics can influence palatability, despite the often incorrect assumption that environmental factors like soil fertility are the biggest driver. It might not be feasible to conduct fuller chemical assays on trees or landscapes in which you want to collect seed or browse for folivores. So how can you get an idea of what is palatable and what isn't? From sampling trees and recording how much the leaves looked munched when we get the branches down, we found that there is a relationship between palatability and the visual condition of the tree crown. So if you want to have a better chance of collecting seed or leaf from a tree that's palatable, then choose a scrappy-looking tree. Like all science, there's a lot of uncertainties and things we don't know. We don't have all the answers about what proportion to plant tree species and trees of various chemical compositions. We don't entirely understand how best to reproduce the type of heterogeneity that arises naturally. There are genuine risks in planting too much of a good thing or too little. Chemical assays are for the most part still time-consuming and relatively expensive, so it's often not possible to know exactly what you're planting from a chemical perspective, even if you did know exactly how much, where, and what to plant. However, like a painter recreating a great landscape with a paintbrush, there are steps we can take to try to reproduce what nature does by using nature as our template. Look locally. I recommend starting by identifying nearby areas to your restoration project with healthy populations of target folivore species. The animals are there because they can eat the food. If at all possible, collect seed from trees in those areas. Since we know there's a strong genetic component to palatability, even though the seeds might not grow into trees with the same chemistry as their parents, you probably have a much better chance of ending up with similar palatability than you would with seed from totally unrelated trees. If you are not able to source seed from those areas, then at least try to use seed from a diversity of parent trees that have been collected from the same region and a similar elevation. Definitely don't source all of your seed from a plantation of trees that have been selected for their vigor and beautiful growth form. Those trees could very well be vigorous and grow beautifully because nothing can eat them. That was actually an option presented to me when I was sourcing seed from seed stores for a restoration project, and it immediately rang alarm bells based on what we know about lush-looking eucalypts. Determine the proportion of different tree species in habitat areas that are supporting healthy but not overabundant numbers of your target species. Use those proportions as guidelines. Consider scale. Forest composition is rarely consistent across wide areas. When determining tree species composition, sample multiple points across the site you're seeking to replicate, and sample across a similar scale to the area you're planning to restore. Be aware of how changes in topography, aspect, and riparian areas correlate to natural changes in tree species composition, and let nature be your guide. Now that we've gone over a quick review of eucalypts as food and how the science of nutritional ecology could help inform revegetation practice, where do we go from here? The next step is applying these principles to landscapes to see if we actually can improve the nutritional quality of remaining habitat to increase carrying capacity and help support healthy populations. Many of the ideas that I've discussed in the last section about how we can apply what we know from nutritional ecology to landscape restoration are not yet common practice. Although the science tells us that planting trees of higher nutritional quality should increase the carrying capacity of landscapes for folivores like the koala, this hasn't been tested in large-scale planting. People do focus on planting a handful of favored browse species, but this ignores what we know about the huge variation in palatability even within the same tree species. Enrichment planting is not a new concept in the agricultural sector, where it is often known as pasture improvement. In this case, high nutritional quality forage species are intentionally planted by farmers to increase the yield of production animals. Given the strong role that nutrition plays in animal health and reproductive success, it makes sense that we should also consider how we can restore not just trees, but nutritional landscapes to maximize their value for wildlife. Of course, this needs to be done carefully to avoid too much of a good thing, which can lead to unsustainably high populations of animals and overbrowsed forests. Done well, though, this could help us make the most of the land that these animals have left, and also restore land that has been damaged through landscape change. This is an interesting idea that has a lot of merit, but really needs some long-term research and investment to see if the outcomes from this strategy are what we would expect. Our nutritional ecology lab at the Australian National University is exploring opportunities to work with the Redland City Council to do just that and improve the nutritional quality of koala habitat. We look forward to working with the Council and other landscape management practitioners to help increase the value of conservation lands for koalas and other eucalypt folivores. Thank you for listening, and thank you to everyone who contributed to the work that I presented here today.